I first encountered Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' Watchmen when I was 16 years old. It was already recognized as a brilliant comic series and is one of the high watermarks of the forum. In the many years since that first reading, I've revisited it often, and have come to appreciate the nuances and details of the work with each subsequent rereading. I also sided with Alan Moore, who feels that everything that needs to be said about the story is already in the comic book itself, and that it should not be revisited or tinkered with. But curiosity got the better of me in 2009 when the film adaptation was released, and I saw the movie in theaters. I thought it was an interesting adaptation that clearly honored many aspects of the source text, but Alan Moore's own rejection of it and the other films based on his work made me reluctant to seek out the later comics and media based on Watchmen. Since then, I've resisted all the expanded media around Watchmen, but this past year, when I heard about the positive reception to some of the recently related releases, I decided to move past the politics and explore the world of Watchmen that's expanded well beyond the original comic series from the late 1980s. I started out by looking to upgrade from my old beat-up copy of the trade paperback to a more premium presentation of the original story. I made another video about that, and you can check it out at the end if you like. But here, I'm going to share my journey through this expanded world and provide a score out of 10 for all the related media to indicate how much I personally enjoyed it, along with some brief commentary on each of them. So after revisiting the Watchmen comic in a new premium edition, I decided to rewatch the film. The film was released in 2009 from director Zack Snyder. In terms of an adaptation of the original comic book maxi series, it's rather faithful. The sequenced panels of the Watchmen comic are already cinematic, as the static camera of the image zooms and pans. This means that devout fans of the source material might get upset when the movie deviates from Moore and Gibbons' original vision, but I think the filmmakers should be applauded for staying as faithful as they did to the original, only moving away from it when they felt it would result in better movie storytelling. Clearly, a work as expansive as the Watchmen comic would have to be abridged to fit into a film, and so there are some obvious changes. The past exploits of the original superhero team, the Minutemen, are reduced to montages here, and for the most part this works quite well. The Black Freighter sequences are all but cut out, which makes sense as they were included in the original as a sort of meta-comic within a comic, and just wouldn't translate well to film. Other smaller subplots, like the frequent interactions at the newsstand and the full story of Rorschach's psychologist Malcolm Long, are trimmed from the original to improve the focus on the central plot in the film. While the ending of the story is altered from the comic to the movie, it can't be denied that the film was made with great reverence to the source material, as it often features direct homages to specific panels from the comic book, lovingly bringing them right to life on the screen. The second half of the movie isn't as compelling as the first, and the film never really blew me away, but it certainly didn't offend me as a fan of the original, because it was clearly made by people who respected and loved the comic books. I'm going to give it a 6 out of 10. As I was researching Snyder's film, I learned that in the promotion leading up to it, they released a DVD with an animated short and another brief feature. I found a copy and checked it out. Tales of the Black Freighter is the main draw here. It turns out that the filmmakers recognized how important the comic within a comic was to Watchmen, so they commissioned a cool animated version of this side story told in the comic. It features pure horror animation, great narration by Gerald Butler, and a song from Nina Simone, one of my favorites, for the closing credits. I'd give this feature a 7 out of 10. The second part of this disc is an in-world documentary looking at the release of the book Under the Hood, which is mostly addressed in the back matter of the comics. This mockumentary is complete with archival newsreel footage, interviews, and nostalgia perfume advertising. It focuses on the Minutemen and sets up the Keene Act. It's cute and fun, but it runs a little long and it lacks some punch. I'd give it a 6 out of 10. It is impressive that Zack Snyder recognized that the reduced role of the Minutemen and the deletion of the pirate comics were omissions, and attempted to address both through this DVD release. There was also a pretty terrible video game released in conjunction with the film. I got a copy of The End is Nigh and played through it. It is very repetitive, but at least the cutscenes are interesting, as they're presented with still images with art direction from Dave Gibbons himself, along with voice acting from the film's actual cast. Still, it only gets a 2 out of 10. Before Watchmen was a group of comic books DC released in 2012 and 2013. From its initial announcement, there was heavy resistance from comic book readers, who felt it was an obvious cash grab. Despite this, I've got to give DC credit. They brought in some top-tier talent on these miniseries, and while some of them are pretty weak, some are certainly worth your time. They've been released as trade paperbacks, as deluxe edition hardcovers, and collected together as an omnibus. I decided to opt for the deluxe editions as I prefer their presentation of the material, and I was easily able to snag all 4 books secondhand. Let's check out the stories one at a time. The Comedian is a 6-issue story by Brian Azzarello. It was neat to see this sadistic character again, but the narrative here is fractured and problematic at times. It bounces between politics and his time in Vietnam, while also exploring his relationship with the Kennedys. I found the story itself a little too incoherent, but thought the art by J.G. Jones was solid. I give this one a 3 out of 10. Rorschach is a 4-issue story also written by Azzarello. Again, it was good to see this character in action, but the story is convoluted here as well. It's just one early Rorschach adventure from 8 years before we meet him in the actual Watchmen book. Luckily, it's a shorter arc, so it has less time to get jumbled, and Lee Bermejo, who's well known for his work from Joker and Batman Noel, provides some pretty cool artwork here. It gets a 4 out of 10. Ozymandias is a 6-issue miniseries that delivers on the promise of Before Watchmen by laying out the entirety of Adrian's story prior to the first panels of the original comic. Len Wein, who is the editor for the original Watchmen, uses straightforward first-person narration throughout. I think he might take some shots at Moore's ending with the Outer Limits origin, but it does a solid job of capturing the character's arrogance. Jay Lee is a distinct artist who's known for his statuesque figures, which fits well here. The story doesn't really go anywhere and tends to play things safe, but it is more satisfying than the previous 2. I'm giving this one a 7 out of 10. Crimson Corsair is a pirate story meant to echo the Black Freighter stuff from the original release. It was initially presented via a 2-page backup at the end of each individual issue in the Before Watchmen series, but is collected as a whole here. The first of the 3 parts is co-written by Len Wein and isn't too bad. The next 2 are written by John Higgins and suffer from problematic storytelling and pacing. The art is decent and appropriate throughout in its throwback EC horror style, but the most interesting aspect of it is seeing original Watchmen colorist John Higgins getting to write and draw a part of this story. It's great to see one of the original creators get to shine, but it's too bad that the story itself was so unsuccessful. It gets a 2 out of 10. Dollar Bill is a one-shot that is also included in this particular collection, and it also suffers from weak storytelling. It reveals a pretty uninspired standard origin for Dollar Bill, culminating in his death, which is something we only hear about in the original Watchmen. The art is mediocre, as is the script by Len Wein. 3 out of 10 for this one. Night Owl is a fun 4-issue look at the second Night Owl's origin and his team-ups with Rorschach. Straczynski's script is easy to follow, if a bit basic, but it's a pleasure to see Joe Kubert ink his son Andy's pencils for the last time here. The story itself explores the sexy underside of the superhero lifestyle, while the relationships between Hollis and Daniel and Walter Kovac are all on point here. It depicts parallel origins for Night Owl and Rorschach, and the eventual connection to the Watchmen story is a satisfying little Easter egg. It gets a 7 out of 10. Dr. Manhattan is a more complex 4-issue series, and it features creative storytelling from Straczynski, and Adam Hughes employs some interesting techniques to support that in his stunning artwork. We get to go to new places in John's early life and learn more about what makes him tick, while his existential crisis in the present makes for some compelling reading. This one gets an 8 out of 10. Moloch is a brief 2-issue tale that gets piggybacked into this collection and provides the origin for the villain who's mentioned and featured in the original comic quite a lot. Straczynski employs strong religious motifs here to help explore Moloch's attempt at redemption, and you feel pity and admiration for this character by the end of this short story. Risso's art isn't my cup of tea though. It features minimalist but clean character work with very few background elements. I'll give it a 7 out of 10. Minutemen is a 6-issue story that works to flesh out the original super team from Watchmen and explains their story far beyond what was hinted at in the original comics. Darwyn Cooke is a master creator, and he writes and draws this whole thing. He uses some interesting techniques like repeated circle images, classic 9-panel homages, and I love when he uses cheesy panels from the Minutemen comic to contrast against the reality of what's happening in his story. He tells great throwback action stories and succeeds in bringing some real depth to his characters. The mystery and the conclusion feel a little unrefined, but on the whole this thing was a pleasure to read because I'm a Cooke superfan. I'll give it an 8 out of 10. Silk Spectre is a 4-issue comic series that looks at the character of the teenage Silk Spectre as she wrestles with her mother's expectations, rebels against them, and eventually comes to accept them on her own terms. This miniseries features great characterization from Amanda Conner and Darwyn Cooke on the script, with unique art from Conner, who does a good job with all the hippie psychedelic elements in the story. It gets a 7 out of 10. Before Watchmen obviously functions as a prequel series to the main Watchmen story. But what about after Watchmen? Well, things get more complicated here, as there are 2 separate sequel trails you can follow. One by Jeff Johns, and one by HBO. The Jeff Johns helmed trail culminates in a comic series called Doomsday Clock. This 12-issue maxi series is not good. The seeds were planted in DC Rebirth Special No. 1 in 2016, and it actually seemed pretty cool at the time. I remember holding my breath and my pulse quickened when I realized what was happening as the issue flipped from the typical DC superhero world into the famous 9-panel grid towards the end of the comic book. I was excited by the possibility of the Watchmen characters interacting with the rest of the DC universe, at least until I saw what they actually had planned. But it took a little while to get there. 2017's The Button is a crossover event between Batman and the Flash, who investigate a Watchmen-related clue that they found in the Batcave. It was interesting, but it felt held back. Part of the reason for this may be that the story was split between 2 creative teams, so it resulted in a disjointed narrative, which truly serves as a teaser or setup for the next chapter. At the time, we assumed it was so the creators who had started this, Jeff Johns and Gary Frank, could have as much room as they needed later to tell their full story. And this was finally unveiled in 2018 and 2019 in the Doomsday Clock, which was supposed to feature a meaningful crossover between the Watchmen and the DC universes. Unfortunately, it gets dragged down by the DC Comics universe's complex continuity. The artwork is the high point of this series, with Gary Frank doing an amazing homage to the original. But the writing is terrible. The story itself is convoluted, which stands in sharp contrast to Watchmen, which was so deliberately structured and sequenced. Here, character arcs are started and abandoned, many events don't materialize into anything meaningful, and the plot is more focused on yet another reset of DC Comics continuity, often getting lost in attempts at meta-commentary on some of those previous resets. I think I'll be skipping the upcoming Absolute edition of this series, as it just wasn't for me. I'm going to give it a 4 out of 10. A different take on After Watchmen is presented in the recent HBO television series. The 2019 series from Damon Lindelof is a remix of sorts, but also serves as a sequel to Watchmen, exploring what happened in the 30 years since the book. It has nice homages and strong faith to the original in its direct references back to the Watchmen comic. There are many nods to the original, including the squids, the revisiting of key scenes and dialogue directly from the comic, and they bring back the potent use of music and lyrics to reinforce elements of the story. For me, the first half of the show worked better, while all the narrative elements didn't quite gel as I wanted them to in the finale. The strong female characters like Agent Blake and Angela don't seem quite as impressive at the end, and some threads are left dangling, which suggests they didn't have the full structure in place before they began the show. Still, I'd give it a 6 out of 10. Finally, I looked at Tom King and Jorge Fornes's 2020 Rorschach comic series. It's set in the Watchmen world of the HBO TV show, with a brief reference to what happens in Oklahoma. In the first issue, a man with a Rorschach mask is shot and killed. We follow an investigator who's looking into the failed assassination attempt on a politician. His work leads him around the country as he tries to piece together the backstory of the suspects. Like the original Watchmen comic, this series contains meta elements that consider the comic medium itself, but also doesn't shy away from exploring competing philosophical perspectives. While the series has a minimal connection to the direct Watchmen world, and actually works against the original as often as it works with it, which might be off-putting to fans who picked it up expecting something else, it appealed to me because it paralleled the complex political intrigue and mystery elements, along with the technical sophistication of the original, without ever being a slave to it. The 8th issue in particular is a masterpiece, with 3 simultaneous interrogations and fantastic color work. Like the original Watchmen did in 1986 and 87, this series is complex and it challenges readers in new ways, which won't be for everyone. But it felt more in line with the spirit of the original to me than any of the other material I looked at in this Watchmen deep dive. It's a 9 out of 10 for me. Obviously, when it comes to Watchmen, nothing will outshine the brilliance of the initial comic story. For 22 years, it essentially existed on its own. Since the debut of Zack Snyder's film, we've seen a steady stream of Watchmen-related content released. While this angers some dedicated fans, I don't think it's going to stop anytime soon. You can either hold true to the original and ignore the rest, or you can jump into the expanding web of related media that has emerged out of the original in the last dozen years. As you can tell by my completely subjective ranking of this material, I didn't enjoy all of it. But if you want to explore the web yourself, I believe that there is indeed some quality content here, and that it is worthy of your time. If nothing else, it can make for a more immersive and engaging experience when you branch out from your reading of a single text to explore the larger context around it.